Hey friends, welcome back to my channel. This is Cruel Intentions, a true crime channel. I am Holly, and with every video I take you on a journey throughout Australian true crime history. If you're interested in Australian true crime and you're excited for some regular scheduling, finally, then consider hitting that subscribe button. Or don't. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm not your real mum and I never will be. So a couple of quick things before we get started on today's case. For some reason, a few of the comments that you guys have left aren't showing on the actual videos, and I can only see them in my notifications. I don't know why this is happening, but a quick shout out to Little Elk Studios and SD for your comments. Thank you so much. Once I figure out why they aren't showing on the actual videos, I will be sure to reply to them, but I just wanted to acknowledge that I have seen them and I appreciate them, and I appreciate all of you. Also, I did plan to have this video out a few days ago, but like 4 of my neighbours have decided that now is a great time to build fences and have their houses re-stumped. So between the trains, the chainsaws, the augers and the earth movers, I probably need to invest in some soundproofing. Anyway, today we're going to discuss the case of the body in the Glenore Grove lagoon and what was referred to at the time as the Lagoon Girl Mystery. Now, I'd actually never heard of this case before reading the book Murder in the Rain by Jim Nichols, but then finding out that this happened about half an hour away from where I live, I really felt like I needed to cover it. So we're going back almost 90 years to Thursday the 31st of August 1933, when some young school children would make a horrific discovery that would shake the small town of Laidley and launch an investigation across 2 Australian states. When Bert Harm and Dudley Kimlin, both aged 11, went to school that day, a friend of theirs, Vic Jacklin, aged 8, told them that he'd seen something floating in the lagoon on his way to school that morning. He told them that he wasn't sure what it was, but it looked much larger than a dead animal. Now, property owners around the area would actually run their cattle through the reserve around the lagoon, and when it was full of water, sometimes a calf would become trapped at the end where it joined up with the creek. Sometimes the boys, if they were able to, would try and pull the calf out of the water so it could join back up with the herd, and sometimes they were too late and it would just be something interesting for them to look at. That day though, as Vic had told them, he was sure that it wasn't a dead calf, it was something much bigger. The boys impatiently waited for the school day to finish so that they could all go down to the lagoon and take a look at what Vic had seen. The group of kids comprised of Dudley and his 9-year-old sister Enid, Bert and his sister Lorna, also 9, Bert's brother Bob, who was 9 as well, and his other brother Eddie, 13, as well as Vic Jacklin and his brother Roy, who was also 9, a lot of 9-year-olds, all headed down to the lagoon, or Billabong as it was known locally, to investigate the strange thing in the water. The girls were instructed to stay behind and look after the horses that Dudley and Enid had ridden, while the boys went to throw sticks at the curious object floating among the pond scum. As the boys casually threw sticks, some of the algae on the surface of the water began to clear, and they could all see that whatever it was much bigger than a small calf, confirming what Vic had told them that morning. Now at that point, one of the boys threw a much larger branch into the water, and as it hit the surface, it moved the object, and all of a sudden, they could all see what it was. A human arm rose out of the water, and then the backside of a person. Dudley Kimlin was quoted as saying, "It just suddenly popped to the surface, and we could tell instantly that it was a dead woman." The group of young children were horrified at what they were looking at. They had inadvertently stumbled across a corpse lying bloated and dead in the water. Eddie Harm, being the oldest of the group, ran to home to tell his 19-year-old brother George what they had just discovered. None of the other kids hung around, instead they all headed home to process what they'd just seen in the lagoon. George immediately got on his bike and headed to the only telephone in the area, located at the Glenore Grove General Store. The shop's owner, Vic Otto, listened to George as he relayed the discovery, and then he promptly called the police. The officer in charge at the Forest Hill Police Station, Constable Bernard McDonnell, received the call at 4:40 p.m. that day, and he thought at first that it might be a prank, that the local kids had cooked up the story to mess with the local officers. But Vic Otto had taken one look at George Harm's face and knew that this was no joke. Within a few minutes of being convinced that this was not some sort of practical joke, MacDonald had contacted not only other local police stations, Laidley and Ipswich, but had also reported it to the police headquarters in Brisbane, and detectives were dispatched from the Brisbane Criminal Investigation Branch, or CIB. Acting Sergeant John Greenhorn arrived from Laidley Police first, only a few minutes away, and he and MacDonald rushed out to the scene, joined shortly after by Constable Albert Edward Hind from the Ipswich branch. As the officers prepared to move the body from the water, a crowd was growing around the lagoon. Word had spread quickly throughout the small country town about the discovery that had been made by the children. After borrowing a small boat from one of the gathering spectators, Constable MacDonald paddled out to where the body was floating, and by fashioning a hook from a length of fencing and securing it to some of the clothing that was still attached to the woman's body, he slowly manoeuvred both the small boat and the body towards the bank of the water. As MacDonald and other officers had dragged the body up onto the shore, assisted by Vic Otto, the onlookers were met with the grisly sight of a very badly decomposed body of a woman. But as the crowd gathered closer, they were also able to see why the body had been mostly submerged for so long. A large stone, around 30 pounds or almost 14 kilograms, had been tied around the woman's neck. It had been attached by a short piece of rope in which multiple knots had been tied, securing the rock in place. As the spectators recovered from the shock of what they had seen, the body was carefully placed onto corn sacks that had been laid down in preparation and loaded into the hearse to be taken back to Laidley for a post-mortem. As the evening wore on, the detectives dispatched from the CIB eventually made their way to the scene. Detective Acting Sergeant Thomas Michael Brunelli and Detective Constable Thomas Burns met with MacDonald and Hurd, as well as several other officers at the bank of the lagoon, and they prepared to take over the investigation. There was still some light available, so Brunelli began examining the lagoon's surroundings until it became too dark to continue, but they were keen to find anything they could to tell them how this woman had ended up in the water, or who she was. The following day, Friday the 1st of September, Brunelli attended the Laidley mortuary to be present at the post-mortem examination of the woman's body. Doctors James Vincent Duhigg and George Cherry were charged with conducting the autopsy, with their main aims being to identify the length of time that the woman had been in the lagoon and to determine the cause of death, as this would enable the detectives to focus their investigation around a specific date range and would help to determine whether they were dealing with a murder or a suicide. The body was in an advanced stage of decomposition, which made the autopsy decidedly difficult. The doctors first examined the external appearance of the woman. Now, as her body had been floating downwards, the blood had settled in the head, colouring it very dark, and the skin was white everywhere else. The body had bloated, distorting the woman's features, but they were still able to make certain inferences. The woman had been between 25 and 35 years old at the time of death. She was just over 5'3". She had a medium build and fairly long dark hair. The clothes that she was wearing, including a red and white dress, a white slip, a vest, and her undergarments, had no labels. She wore no jewellery, and so far as they could tell, she had no other identifying features, no scars, no birthmarks, and no tattoos. She did have marks around her throat, but it was impossible to tell if she had sustained these before the large heavy rock had been tied around her neck. There were no obvious external injuries to the woman's body, and so the doctors then turned their attention to the internal organs. They began to examine the lungs, and they found that they were still intact, not yet having succumbed to any decomposition. And this made it possible to examine the bronchial passages, and in doing so, they found them filled with a fine white foam. This meant that the woman was still breathing when she entered the water. They found her stomach completely empty with no signs of poison or irritants. But the most startling part of the autopsy was yet to come, when the doctors realised as they made their way through the examination that this woman had been 4 months pregnant when she had died. Effectively, the investigators were now dealing with 2 deaths, not 1. Dr. Duhigg concluded that the woman's cause of death was asphyxiation due to drowning, but was unable to confirm whether someone else had tied the rock around her neck and thrown her into the water, or if she herself had chosen to take her own life. As to how long she'd been in the water, Duhigg made the reasonable assertion that the date of death was between 5 and 7 days prior to the discovery of the body. What he'd failed to consider was the frigid temperature of the water, which had slowed the rate of putrefaction considerably, as the woman had entered the water during the winter, and so while this assumption was reasonable based on the level of decomposition, it had actually occurred over a longer period of time. The detectives, however, weren't to know this as they began their investigations, and so took the time frame they were given by the government pathologist and medical officers and focused their inquiries around the wrong date. Now, because of the lack of identification found with the woman, time was of the essence to find out who she was. Brunelli decided that the quickest way to do this would be to circulate photographs of the woman's face, which may trigger someone to come forward claiming to know who she was, even though the bloating and distortion of the face would make that very difficult. Owing to the poor state of the corpse and the heat of the day and the time factor, instead of waiting until that evening for the CIB photographer to arrive, Brunelli decided to request the services of Victor Muller, a night officer at the Laidley railway station and a known amateur photographer. He had previously won prizes at annual exhibitions for his photography, but he mainly took pictures of produce, inanimate objects, and he was horrified at the request made of him by the CIB. He did agree, though, and took a series of photographs of the woman's face, but he would never forget the gruesome sight of the woman's body lying in the mortuary, pale as a ghost. The camera he used is actually now part of the collection at the Laidley Historical Society. As the photos were being processed, Brunelli and his team went back to Glenore Grove Lagoon to try to find anything around the banks that might give them the slightest hint at who the woman was or what had happened to her. Brunelli knew from experience that most adult drowning cases were people taking their own lives, and it was very rare for a homicide to involve death by drowning. Even in murder cases where people had been found in or around water, the victim was usually killed in some other manner before being submerged, either in efforts to hide the body or to throw off detectives. The woman may have decided to take her own life, but the part of that theory that didn't sit right with Brunelli was the rock tied around her neck. It wasn't that it was there to begin with. If the woman had been determined to take matters into her own hands, then she may well have decided to weigh herself down. It was the manner in which the rock was attached. There was only 12 inches of rope between the woman's neck and the large stone, and the knot around her throat had been tied at the back. When the investigators found an impression in the ground matching the shape of the rock, they realised that she would have had to have dragged that rock to the point where she had entered the water, and she would have had to have laid down, perhaps with the rock next to her or sitting on top of her, to have been able to tie it herself. The detective reasoned that this was still a possibility, and she may have tied the knot around her neck in the same way that women had the ability to do up a necklace or to button a high-collared blouse or dress. Of course, at this time there were only male detectives, so they had no female colleagues to offer an argument that doing up a button or necklace would have been completely and utterly different to firmly securing a knot at the back of the neck that was also or subsequently then attached to a large 14-kilogram rock with only 1 foot of rope. The investigators focused on trying to find any items that may have belonged to the woman: a handbag, her hat, her shoes. Finding these items may have helped indicate where the woman had entered the water, especially the shoes. Even though at that time women would not be generally seen without a hat or handbag, the shoes were of great importance to the investigators. Firstly, because they may contain a manufacturer's label, which would assist in identification. But also because if this woman had come to the lagoon alone, her shoes would have to have been somewhere nearby, and there were no marks or tears on her stockings when she was found that would have indicated that she walked anywhere barefoot. They may have ended up on the floor of the lagoon, but it was also possible that if she had been murdered, that the perpetrator had taken her things with them after throwing her into the water, which would account for the missing personal items. The detectives were beginning to lose daylight. By now it had been over 24 hours since the woman's body had been recovered from the water, and police still didn't know who she was or how she'd ended up there. They started to prepare to drag the lagoon to see if they could find anything under the water that might assist them in identifying the unknown woman. While Brunelli was leading the search efforts, other police constables were charged with questioning some of the children that had originally discovered the body. Eddie Harm, the 13-year-old boy who had rushed home to report the discovery originally, was questioned by investigators about what exact position the body was in when they saw it, before they began throwing sticks at it, whether anyone had touched it before the police had arrived. The whole thing was overheard by his siblings, who had crept downstairs to overhear the questioning. The entire town was enthralled by the discovery and continuing investigation. Nothing like this had ever happened in the small town before, and considering Glenore Grove only had a population of less than 300 people at the time, every update and every movement of the detectives was quickly circulated throughout the community. Many of the residents would hover around the lagoon as the detectives searched the banks, and people even just passing through nearby Toowoomba Road would pull into the reserve and park their vehicles to watch the officers at work. The investigators began to drag the lagoon on Saturday the 2nd of September. They borrowed another small boat from a resident of the town and dropped a line with numerous hooks into the water, rowing back and forth along the surface. They would pull in the line at regular intervals, check the hooks, and then cast them back into the water. At one point, they even brought in a large acetylene or carbide lamp rigged to a boat and directed it to point downwards into the water to try and light up the bottom of the lagoon. The lamp used a chemical reaction of calcium carbide and water to create acetylene gas, which in turn creates a wide, bright white flame which burns in front of a metal reflector. They were more commonly used for mining and caving, and this was the first time that most of the residents of Glenore Grove had ever seen one, so the process drew a very large crowd. The experiment was unfortunately unsuccessful as the water was still too deep for the light to penetrate. So far, nothing had been brought up from the bottom of the lagoon, and the only other course of action would have been to drain the water completely. But there were millions of litres of water in the lagoon at the time, and it would not only take too long, but would be totally impractical to do so. They reasoned that the search efforts would be more fruitful if they could determine where the body had entered the water. Based on the kids' information of where they'd first seen it and where the police had eventually recovered it, the body had drifted about 8 feet or about 2.5 meters within that time. Conducting experiments by using a number of light buoyant vessels and setting them adrift, they tried to see if there was a current in the water to attempt to determine what direction the body had come from and where it might have started. But the lagoon was motionless. The only thing that affected the vessels was the wind that sometimes blew across the surface. Eventually, bloodhounds were brought in to try and sniff out any items that may have belonged to the woman, and the officers and detectives felt sure that she would not have come to the lagoon with no personal items or shoes, and that there must be something somewhere around that belonged to her if this was indeed the case of someone taking their own life. The detectives eventually even requested the assistance of a local Indigenous tracker named Jack McGrath, who had been employed by the Oxley police 4 months earlier due to his intimate knowledge of the land. McGrath began diving into the lagoon, scouring the depths for anything that might point to the identity of the unknown woman. but nothing was found anywhere in or around the water or the reserve that the lagoon was on that gave investigators any clue as to who this woman might have been. There were no outstanding missing persons reports in either Forest Hill, Gatton or the Laidley areas. The police also knew that the main road from Brisbane to Toowoomba ran close by the lagoon, which is why so many people had pulled off there to watch the search. So it was very possible that this woman may have been a complete stranger to the area. No one in those 3 towns had recognised the woman from the pictures that had been circulated. The train station attendants from each town also confirmed that they hadn't seen her leaving any trains from any of the platforms. The investigators thought that even if this woman wanted to remain unknown, that it was a stretch to imagine that she had travelled a long distance just for the single purpose of suicide. Perhaps she had come out to the area for some other reason. She had been 4 months pregnant. They reasoned that maybe she had tried to track down the father of her child, because there were no reports of a husband or any man reporting that a woman who had been pregnant with his child had disappeared. Maybe she had tried to plead with this man to take responsibility for the child that she was carrying. Maybe that man had turned her away and she had been so devastated by this that she had chosen to end her life. The detectives were inclined to follow up on this line of thought because if it was true or the father of the child was local, then at least they'd have a starting point for the investigation. While some of the detectives scoured through missing persons reports from areas surrounding the Glenore Grove Lagoon looking for any women that may have been reported missing elsewhere, they also looked into any reports of missing men. After the report of the body being found in its pregnant state, they thought that the man, whether he was responsible or not for her death, may have tried to leave the area knowing that the police would be looking for him. No men from the district had been reported missing though, and there was no indication that any men had left the area recently whose behaviour was suspect to anyone that knew them. A local from the area did report that 2 groups of nomad travellers had come through the area around the 25th of August, which matched the time frame that the pathologist had given detectives for the woman's time of death. He told police that he recognised the girl and said that she had drawn attention to herself because she had been offering fortune-telling to the locals. Brunelli and Hurd began to try and track down the travellers. There were 2 groups that had met up about 50 miles or 80 kilometres outside of the town and had travelled together until they had arrived at Glenore Grove. They'd stayed for a while, but eventually had split up and gone their separate ways. The detectives managed to track down the first group in a Brisbane suburb, Wynnum, but upon arriving, they found the girl that the man had been referring to alive and well. Police decided to pursue the second group just to check if any of them had seen or heard anything that might assist them, but when they caught up with them in Calbar, another 60 miles or 100 kilometres away, they weren't able to ascertain any further information. The detectives left empty-handed, with no more information, no evidence, and still no answers as to who the woman had been or what had happened to her. On Sunday the 3rd of September, 4 days after the woman had been pulled from the water, she was laid to rest in plot 339 of the Laidley Cemetery. Her grave was unmarked. There was no ceremony, no headstone, no one to speak for her, no family, no friends, and still no clue as to her identity. She was simply buried, surrounded by just a few police officers and detectives. As the investigation continued, the local Brisbane newspapers began to report the gruesome discovery. Sales of the Truth newspaper skyrocketed, and Brisbane residents were eager for any information they could get about the unidentified woman found in the lagoon with a rock tied around her neck. In the days following the burial of the woman from the lagoon, detectives were determined to figure out who she was. They extended their search area to over 100 square miles, or almost 300 square kilometres. They spoke to multiple family members who had reported missing loved ones, and in the Petrie Terrace police station in Brisbane, they began the arduous task of showing each and every person who came in the photograph of the woman's face. As the families looked at the picture, the change in their expressions was noticeable as they breathed a sigh of relief, confirming that this woman, whose features were bloated and distorted, whose skin was blotchy and discoloured from the blood that had gravitated to her head, was not the loved one that they had been searching for. As September came to an end, Brunelli decided to take another course of action and use the only clue left to him to create another line of inquiry. A dental plate had been removed from the mouth of the woman as part of the post-mortem. Now, in 1930s Australia, forensic dentistry wasn't a thing. In fact, it wasn't until the 1950s that forensic dentistry even began being practiced as part of investigations into unidentified persons, and there still wasn't any formal training or qualification for that branch of forensics. And so 25 years before this, Brunelli, having no other avenue to look into, decided to have an exact written description and photographs of the dental plate sent to every single police station and officer in Queensland, with the instruction that the officers were to take the photographs and description to every dentist in their respective towns. The plate itself consisted of 10 teeth, with 2 gaps in the plate to allow for the woman's natural teeth. 4 of the teeth in the plate were gold. Surely a dentist would recognise the gold teeth so prominent in the front of the plate. But by the start of October, Brunelli still hadn't had any luck trying to find the dentist that may have made the plate belonging to the woman. He then decided to circulate the photograph and description of the plate throughout Australia in a last-ditch attempt to try and find anyone who knew anything about it and who it might have belonged to. In a small town in New South Wales called Taree, the police force had shown the write-up and picture to a dentist by the name of George Jackson. Jackson instantly recognised the work as his own. Unlike many dentists and orthodontists at that time, Jackson also kept accurate written records and charts of all of his patients. A telegram was sent to Brunelli, still in Queensland, who immediately left Brisbane and headed south to Taree. He was met by the local police department and escorted to George Jackson's surgery and dental practice. When Brunelli arrived, he found that Jackson was eager to help in any way possible. Jackson told him that he had methodically looked over his charts and was positive the plate was his work and that he could identify the unknown woman. After weeks of search efforts, questioning and dead ends, Brunelli was about to finally learn who she was. George Jackson told Brunelli that he had made that plate for a woman named Clarice Margaret Murphy. He also told the detectives that she had lived in Taree for a few months and he would often do dental work for her. Brunelli finally knew the woman's name, but the rest of the mystery was still just that, a mystery. Considering that Jackson had told him Clarice had lived in the area for a little while, he began to speak to the residents of Taree to see what he could find out about her and how she may have come to be found in Glenore Grove over 7 hours away. Through questioning some of the locals, he found out that Clarice Murphy had arrived in Taree about 7 months earlier in March of 1933. She had quickly picked up work as a waitress in a local hotel. Not an easy feat considering this was the height of the Great Depression, and it was common for crowds of unemployed people to travel from country town to country town. Police stations were tasked with providing rations, and these groups would camp on the roadside and collect rations until they were forced to move on. Brunelli could understand why she had been so far away from Taree if she had been unemployed, but according to many of the locals, she had a steady job in the hotel and became friends with many people within the town. Through these friends, Brunelli gained valuable information about Clarice's past. She had been previously married twice, once to a man named Aloysius Murphy, hence Clarice's married name, and once to a man named Stanley McCrow. Brunelli discovered that they both lived in Sydney and made the 3.5-hour journey and met up with Sydney CIB officers to go out and question both men. Neither men had travelled recently and neither seemed to know anything about Clarice's movements. Both men were quickly cleared of any suspicion, and Brunelli made the trip back to Taree with no further answers to the mounting questions he had about what had happened to Clarice Murphy. Once back in Taree, Brunelli continued to question the residents on the movements of Clarice. He was told on a recommendation from a close friend of hers, a man named Arthur Burns, Clarice had left her job at the hotel to work as a domestic for an elderly woman, Mrs. Noon. He tracked down where she lived and arrived on her doorstep. He asked Mrs. Noon if she knew Clarice Murphy, and Mrs. Noon told Brunelli that of course she knew Clarice. She had worked domestically at the house for about a month, before she had left in June about 3 months earlier. Since then, she had heard from Clarice a couple of times. The woman, who seemed surprised by the line of questioning, asked if anything had happened to her, and the detective had to be the one to tell her that Clarice's body had been found a few weeks ago in the Glenore Grove, over 7 hours away in another state. Mrs. Noon was shocked by that news. She told the detective that she liked Clarice very much. She was a good worker and a good friend, and she was sorry that Clarice had died in that manner. Brunelli told Mrs. Noon that Clarice had been 4 months pregnant, and when asked if she knew anything about Clarice's private life and if she knew of any men that Clarice had been close or intimate with, Mrs. Noon told him that Clarice had been very close with a local shoemaker and repairer, Arthur Burns, the same one that had recommended she go and work for Noon in the first place. She also told Brunelli that Clarice hadn't ever mentioned being in that sort of trouble and had never mentioned any man who had done anything wrong by her, and that's really all she knew about the woman's private life. An order of apprehension was quickly put out for Arthur Burns, who, like Clarice's ex-husband, was also located in Sydney. He was brought the few hours back to the Taree police station where Brunelli was waiting. Through his interrogation of Burns, Brunelli learnt some valuable information. Burns had last seen Clarice Murphy in Kempsey. Kempsey was a small town just over an hour north of Taree. He had been travelling with 2 men, all hoping to take the shoe repair business on the road, trying to survive through the Great Depression by soliciting small towns for shoemaking and repair work. They had tapped out the Taree residents, and with no customers left to be had there, they decided to make the business a travelling one, to make a few dollars from small country towns. Clarice had come to Kempsey to visit with one of Burns' business partners, and this man had suddenly announced to Burns and his other associate that Clarice Murphy would be joining them on their travels. Burns was none too happy about this. It had been hard enough to support the 3 of them, let alone another person who didn't know anything about the shoemaking business. There was barely enough revenue to buy food and shelter for the 3 men, and now one of his business partners had just decided to add another person, another burden in Burns's opinion. Burns had vehemently objected to Clarice joining the party, but his partner was adamant that she was to stay with them. Burns and this man had a fierce argument about the issue, but the man wouldn't budge, and so Burns had decided that he didn't want to be a part of it. He left the group and headed back home to try and make his own living. Brunelli asked him if he was aware that Clarice had been 4 months pregnant. The news shocked Arthur Burns. He had had no idea that Clarice had been with child when he had seen her in Kempsey. When asked if he could be responsible for her pregnancy, he emphatically denied it. He told the detective that although he was a friend of Clarice and had even taken her to a few dances, they had never been intimate. He also made sure the detective knew that it wasn't jealousy that had driven him from the group. Burns then told Brunelli the names of the men that he'd been travelling with. One, a young man named John William Burgess Smith, known as Jack, and the man that Clarice had come to visit, John Wyatt Noon, also known as Jack. At the mention of this name, things started falling into place for Brunelli. Jack Noon was the son of the elderly Mrs. Noon, the woman that had employed Clarice Margaret Murphy for a month before leaving in June. Clarice had worked for Mrs. Noon at about the same time that she would have had to have conceived her child, and Jack Noon was the man that she'd gone to visit with. Brunelli was finally starting to get some answers to the many questions that had been raised when he had discovered who the body in the lagoon was. Now armed with this new information, Brunelli left Taree and headed back to CIB headquarters in Brisbane. Shortly after he arrived back in Brisbane, he received a report from Laidley. Woman's clothing had been discovered in a dam in a town called Kingaroy, about 2.5 hours away from the place where Clarice Murphy's body was found. Was this somehow connected to Clarice, or was there another body just waiting to be found in the same way that hers had been? While Brunelli was taking in this new information, and while speculation from the Laidley community reached an all-time high, another important breakthrough was made in the case of the body in the Glenore Grove lagoon. On the 11th of October 1933, Brunelli received an urgent message. 2 men had been arrested near Kingaroy in connection with the death of Clarice Murphy. Immediately, Brunelli made plans to leave Brisbane and head northwest to the flourishing farm town of Kingaroy. When he arrived, he was greeted by the local police and joined by Constable Hurd of Ipswich. He reported first to Inspector Timothy Carlane and Detective Acting Sergeant Joseph McCulloch, both of whom had travelled from the Maryborough police station. Brunelli was then briefed by the local police officers about the 2 men they had in custody and what had led to their arrests. The evening before, at about 5:30 Tuesday the 10th of October, Constable James Francis Fallon received a note, dropped off to the nearby Cumbia police station by a local farmer, Harry Freeman. Fallon's mouth dropped as he read the words in the letter. To the Sergeant, Dear Sir, if you require information on the Glenore Grove tragedy, you can come along to Mr. Harry Freeman's farm at Boyneside, where you will find me employed, as you will have to arrest me, as I was with the man who did for the girl found at Glenore Grove some weeks back. Further information when we meet, yours, etc. The letter was signed simply, Jack. Fallon moved quickly. He alerted Sergeant Arthur Casey and Constable Walter Mark Wagland from the Kingaroy police station. Casey and Wagland stopped at the Cumbia station and picked up Fallon and headed straight for the Freeman's farm in Boyneside. As the group of officers approached the farmhouse, they saw the silhouette of a man inside the front window sitting at a table. They could see that he was watching them as they drove up, and when Casey and Fallon stepped out of the police car and walked up the driveway, before they could even knock on the door, he'd already opened it. They asked if he was the man known as Jack and if he was the one that had written the letter to the police. The man admitted that he was Jack and that he had, indeed, written the letter to the sergeant. As the 3 men walked back down into the yard, they asked Jack what his full name was. It was John William Burgess Smith. Fallon asked him what he wanted to see them about, and Jack Smith replied that he was with the man that murdered the girl at Glenore Grove. It had been worrying him sick ever since it had happened, and he knew that the police would come for him sooner or later, so he decided to take it upon himself to make sure that it was sooner. I couldn't take it anymore, he said to them. I knew the police were making inquiries around here about what had happened. I wrote to my mother, and when I got her reply, I wrote you the letter. The officers asked what he knew about the woman who was found in the Glenore Grove lagoon. He told them that her name was Clarice Margaret Murphy. Fallon asked Smith if he had any part in murdering the woman and warned him that if he had, then Fallon was bound by law to warn him that he didn't need to say anything, but if he chose to speak, then anything he said would be taken down and used as evidence. Smith said that he just wanted to get the whole thing off his mind. He said that he would tell the officers anything and everything that they needed to know, that he would tell them the whole truth. They took Smith to the Kingaroy station where the questioning continued. Casey asked Smith the name of the man that was with him the night that Clarice was murdered. Jack Smith told him the man's name was Jack Noon. Smith, between talking with the officers there at the farm and being taken back to the station for further questioning, told the 3 officers everything he knew, starting from the beginning. John William Burgess Smith was 23 years old. He'd moved from his hometown in Bellingen, New South Wales to Port Macquarie, 100 miles or over 160 kilometres away in search of work. Times were tough. It was the peak of the Great Depression in Australia, and when he landed a job as a handyman in the Port Macquarie Commercial Hotel, he was ecstatic. The unemployment rate at the time was over 23%, with a further 8% of Australians only able to get part-time work. The many hordes of people that were unable to find work and travelled from town to town were known as the Soldiers of Despair. Jack Smith was happy to have had stable work, but on Thursday the 1st of June 1933, he was told that the hotel was passing into new ownership and that he was going to be laid off. He was devastated. There was little to no work available in the town, and he didn't know what he was going to do. On that same day, though, through an unfortunate twist of fate, he was to meet John Jack Wyatt Noon. Noon had come into the hotel to discuss business with the soon-to-be ex-owner. Smith saw Noon at the hotel. The older man had a strong presence. He was 5'7", thick black hair, and Smith could see that he was muscular, and thought it must be from his years of hard work. Smith thought that Noon looked like someone with influence, money, and someone who might be able to help him. Noon told Smith that he was in business with Arthur Burns and that they were travelling from town to town mending boots and shoes. He told the young man that they were working with a new kind of product developed by the Dunlop Rubber Company, chrome-hide boot rubber. In the course of this conversation, Smith told Noon that he was losing his job at the hotel, and almost immediately, Noon offered to have Smith join himself and Arthur Burns in their business. "Join us," he told Smith. "Come with me and Arthur, and you can drum up work for us." He told Smith that they were planning to head to a few towns and that they would give Smith a small cut of the repair work if he would go through the towns and solicit the residents for work. Smith, a minute ago thinking he was out of a job, was now being offered steady work from a man who drove a fancy car, who ran his own business, who had enough to provide for him on the journey. Smith swiftly and gratefully accepted the offer and packed up the little he owned to join Noon and Burns in their venture. They loaded into Noon's Chevrolet Tourer along with the repair business tools and materials and their camping gear, and a week after Noon had offered Smith the position, he left with Noon and Burns heading to Kempsey. Smith noticed that although Burns was supposed to be the senior partner in the business, Noon seemed to be the one making all the decisions and calling all of the shots. While staying in Kempsey, Smith began learning about who Noon was. He was 42 years old and had lived up north in Kingaroy in Queensland for many years, before travelling to New South Wales in February of that year to visit his family in his hometown of Taree. He had previously been married, but 4 years earlier his wife had run off with another man and left him. He did have a daughter to the woman though, Rosetta Alma Noon, who was 18. He also learnt that Noon was engaged to be married to a woman named Alice Leasegang, who lived in Crawford, a village just outside of Kingaroy. He had been working on a farm there owned by Alice's father. The three had been staying in Kempsey for about 10 days, when on Sunday the 18th of June, Smith and Burns were sitting at a breakfast table when Noon joined them, and with him was a woman. Noon introduced the woman to Smith. Her name was Clarice Margaret Murphy. It didn't take long for Smith to realise that number one, Burns already knew this woman, and that two, she and Noon seemed to be very close old acquaintances. He found out that Clarice had recently worked as a housekeeper for Noon's mother. Smith noted that the woman was very well dressed and quite attractive, but Burns didn't seem happy at all to see her. When Noon declared that Clarice would be joining and travelling with them, Burns objected. Noon seemed to lose it with Burns and the pair fought angrily, and Burns abruptly decided to leave. He was not happy with the addition to the group and thought it better to part ways. Smith was beginning to question his decision to come along with Noon. He'd been shaken by the sharp altercation between Noon and Burns. He had not realised that Noon's temper was so short, and the outburst had scared him. And now this woman who had suddenly shown up had been invited by Noon to travel with them indefinitely. Who was she to him? How had she known where to find them, and why was it so important that she stay with them? Smith thought that he already knew. While they'd been travelling, Noon had told him about a woman that he had gotten pregnant while she was working as a domestic at his mother's house. Noon had not mentioned any names to him at the time, but at his insistence of having Clarice stay with them, he figured it must have been her. And Noon, all the while, was supposedly engaged to someone else. Clarice, while on the train in Kempsey, had befriended a man who had also been travelling on the train. The four people, Clarice, Noon, Smith and this man, all had lunch together, and around 3 o'clock that afternoon they loaded into Noon's Chevrolet and headed for a town called Maxville, only about 45 minutes away. The man who had travelled on the train with Clarice had previously worked at Taronga Park Zoo, but had found himself, like so many others, without work. He had used his passing friendship with Clarice to attach himself to the group so he could get a lift out of town. The car was quite overcrowded when they'd gone to leave. Smith had found it hard not to notice the luggage that Clarice had brought with her. They had had to find room for her 2 large suitcases as well as several smaller bags and other belongings. It looked as if she was carrying everything she owned. That night, the group stayed in the Frickles Hotel in Maxville. Noon was in charge of securing the rooms. He booked 2 single rooms for Smith and the stranger, and then booked 1 double room for himself and Clarice. Smith was made to further question his decision to join the group when Noon told him the next morning that he would be responsible for settling the accounts for not only his single room, but Noon and Clarice's doubles as well. That same day in town, Clarice went to a local jeweller and purchased a small gold ring, which she began to wear as a wedding band. The party of 4 moved across to Gillette's boarding house, where Noon and Clarice booked another double room, now identifying themselves as Mr. and Mrs. Noon. The man that had travelled with Clarice on the train needed to move on to his next destination, so said his farewells to the group and continued on his way. Noon, Smith and Clarice Murphy ended up staying at the boarding house for 12 days, and in that time Arthur Burns had managed to track them down. He told the group that he wanted to rejoin them, that he wanted to pick up where they left off, in the shoe repair business. Noon agreed to have him join them again, and they stayed in Maxville until the 30th of June. As they prepared to finally move on, Burns could not keep his opinion quiet. He spoke to Noon about the situation that they were in. "We're supposed to be running a business," he had said. "As it is, we're hardly making enough money to keep the 3 of us, let alone an extra one. Either she goes or I go." Noon replied with only 2 words: "She stays." Burns was fuming. He finally threw in the towel for good. He told Noon that that was it. He was finished. As far as he was concerned, Noon could keep half of the tools and half of the cromhide rubber, and that he, Burns, was done. That evening, Friday the 30th of June, after driving for about 25 miles or 40 kilometres, the group that was now just Noon, Smith and Clarice Murphy arrived in Smith's hometown of Bellingen. Smith was undecided about what to do. He was realising that he didn't know this man, John Noon, very well, and he was unsure if he wanted to continue travelling with him. But he had no family left in Bellingen. His mother had moved away from the town a few years ago, he had no job prospects, and he eventually decided that it was probably better to stay with Noon. At least it couldn't be any worse than being homeless with no job and no family around. The 3 stayed at Mr. and Mrs. Griffin's boarding house for a total of 8 days, with Smith occupying a single room and Noon and Clarice, now travelling as Mr. and Mrs. Noon, staying in a double. As they planned to continue moving, they decided, or at least Noon decided, to head back down the coast towards Coffs Harbour, where they stayed just over 2 weeks, drumming up business, making repairs, and earning what little money they could. They then moved through the towns of Nana Glen, Bluffs Creek, and eventually found themselves in Grafton. They had been camping or staying in boarding houses and had even made friends with a family who were travelling in a caravan and had stayed with them for a few nights. Noon decided that the bigger town of Grafton was not to his liking and they would be moving on. This was surprising to Smith, who thought that the larger town would be better for business, but he had learnt over the past couple of months that he was not to argue with Noon, that Noon made the decisions and he did not like to be questioned or second-guessed. On Saturday the 29th of July, they left Grafton, and after camping for one night in Chimera Creek, they found themselves in the town of Casino. They would stay in Casino for 3 weeks. It was here that Smith began to notice the frequent arguments between Clarice and John Noon. He could see that Noon was growing ever resentful of her presence, and she, wanting to be looked after and cared for, was becoming tired of the constant moving around, camping, and long stays in small towns. As they began to fight with increased regularity and hostility, Clarice began to open up to Smith more and more, taking comfort in his presence, and even giving him the nickname Little Jack. She told him that this was mainly to avoid confusion, because John also went by Jack. But she told Smith that the name Little Jack suited him. Smith was a good listener, and Clarice would often spend more time with him than she would with Noon. She was flirtatious, she would tease him, laugh with him, and she was much closer to his age, which he thought was a contributing factor of them getting along better than she had been with Noon. He had absolutely no wish to be anything other than her friend, though. As far as he was concerned, she was Noon's companion. They were travelling as a married couple, and he knew, even if she didn't know that he knew, that she was pregnant with Noon's child. As they began to talk more, though, Clarice became more confident that she could trust Little Jack, and so one day she told him. "I'm in the family way to Jack," she had said to him. She told him it happened in the unlucky month of May at his mother's house in Taree when she was her housekeeper. She had gone and bought the small wedding ring in Maxville to make a show of being married to Noon, as of course at the time it would have been improper to not be married when you're with child, and as far as Clarice was concerned, they were as good as married anyway. He had, of course, already been aware of this, but she continued with new information. She told him that Big Jack had written to her not long before Burns, Smith and Noon had left on their travels and told her where they were heading, and that's why she'd been able to catch up with them at Kempsey. This was a shock to Smith. He knew that Noon was engaged to a wealthy farm owner's daughter in Kingaroy. It didn't seem like Noon really wanted to have much to do with Clarice, but had written to her, telling her where they were, and had also refused to budge on her joining them. Little Jack decided it was none of his business. If Noon wanted her to stay with them for whatever reason, then that was his decision. What Noon would do when he eventually got back to Kingaroy, Smith didn't know, and to be honest, he didn't care. That was between Noon, Clarice, and the other woman he was supposed to marry, and probably her father too. A couple of days later, however, after a spiteful and bitter argument between Noon and Clarice, Noon said something to Smith that would make the fate of Clarice Murphy his business. Noon had come to Smith after this particular fight and said to him, "I'm going to do away with her. I can't take her back to Kingaroy." Smith was effectively speechless and gave no response to the older man. As they continued their stay in Casino, what Noon had said to him really sank in. He felt sure that Noon wasn't serious about what he'd said. Surely this threat couldn't be sincere. Smith thought about leaving, about getting out of the situation altogether, but once again he was faced with the choice of leaving with no work, no home, no money, and no transport, or staying and hoping that Noon hadn't been serious and that he was just still worked up over their heated argument. He depended on Noon for work, and so made the choice to stay and hope that nothing happened to Clarice. He fleetingly thought about reporting Noon to the local police, but what would he say? That he knew a guy who said he might do in for a woman? Even when he said it to himself, it sounded flimsy at best. Noon would just deny it, and then he would know that Smith had gone to the authorities. He was scared about what might happen to him if he tried to talk to a police officer about what Noon had said. He also briefly thought about maybe telling Clarice what Noon had said, but not knowing whether she would believe him and thinking that even if she did believe that Big Jack had said it, she wouldn't think he would actually do anything, so he decided against speaking up. He was intimidated by Noon, and the older Jack's influence over him quashed any moral responsibility he had to warn Clarice that her life might be in danger. Smith was still in the throes of this moral dilemma when he fell ill, so badly that he was actually admitted to the casino hospital and wasn't discharged for a week. While he was getting treatment, John Big Jack Noon and Clarice Murphy found accommodation at a boarding house owned by Mrs. Eliza Plummer. The group frequently used boarding houses because they provided inexpensive accommodation in small rooms with basic facilities. They were commonly full of those soldiers of despair that roamed the countryside and back roads of Australia looking for work, and there were usually a fair few of them in each town to accommodate the travellers. Eliza Plummer noticed immediately that Clarice was pregnant upon their arrival at the boarding house, and being a very traditional woman, she didn't tolerate any guests or behaviour that might at that time have been considered immoral. Noon and Clarice maintained the facade that they were a happily married couple. While they stayed there, Clarice and Eliza became good friends, Clarice confiding in the woman that she was sick and tired of the constant travelling. Eliza Plummer offered to have Clarice stay there with her for £1 a week while her husband continued his journey and while he built up savings from the business. Clarice thought this idea was wonderful, but when she asked her husband, he refused, and not just refused, but was outraged at the suggestion and point-blank told Clarice it was out of the question. Eliza Plummer was shocked at the reaction, considering Clarice's condition, and told Noon that surely Clarice would be better off staying in casino with her, at least until the baby came, and then they could find stable housing and work. John Noon again refused and told the woman that he was taking Clarice to a farm in Wollumbar. Smith was discharged from the hospital on Friday the 18th of August. He had hoped that while he'd been sick and unable to help Noon find work in the town, that Noon and Clarice might have given him up as a lost cause and left without him. After all, neither of them had called to check on him or even once made a visit to his hospital bedside. But, alas, this was not the case. As he walked out of the hospital doors, he looked down the path to see John Noon standing by the gates. Smith had a feeling he was walking into a trap as he slowly made his way to greet the older man. "Right," said Noon, "we've been waiting for you. Now we can move on in the morning. We're heading for Kingaroy." Smith got into Noon's car, and as far as Smith knew, they were heading back to the boarding house. But John Noon drove them to the casino post office instead, where he picked up a small package. When he got back to the car, he'd opened the parcel, and inside had been a small green bottle. He told Smith that he had written to his daughter Rosetta back in Taree for some poison. "This," he told Smith, "is strychnine. I'm going to give it to Clarice." Big Jack Noon was not about to let a woman he'd had a brief fling with back in Taree ruin his intended marriage to Brad Leesegang's daughter. He knew how much land his future father-in-law owned and knew that he stood to inherit a large chunk of not only the land, but the respect that he thought he rightly deserved. If anyone found out that he had engaged in an illicit affair with his mother's housekeeper and had gotten her pregnant, the wedding would be off and he would be left with nothing. Nothing but a child he didn't want and a woman he was growing to despise. He had been trying, by way of sending Clarice letters, to let her down gently, to slowly disappear, but in telling her where he'd been heading and not leaving soon enough, he'd actually enticed her to find him. Now, Clarice Murphy had suffered through marriage and divorce twice before. Married first at 18, she had her first child, and then her husband had left her. She was married again after that, having another child to her second husband, and then he as well had shirked his responsibilities to not only her, but her children as well. Her mother had stepped in to look after her 2 children, while Clarice, also suffering from the depression sweeping the country, left to find steady work to be able to provide for her family. In another cruel twist of fate, she'd taken the job for Jack Noon's mother and entered into her relationship with Big Jack. While this might have been just a brief fun fling for him, she fell pregnant, which didn't mean anything to Noon, but she was determined to make sure that this child's father would not abandon her like the others had. So she'd packed up all of her belongings and travelled to Kempsey to ensure that Noon would be accountable for his actions. Although Noon was surprised that Clarice had turned up in Kempsey, he didn't seem to have any issues picking up where they left off. Might be fun to have her along for the ride for a while. But he knew, as did Smith, that his future was with Alice Lissagang in Kingaroy. It was obvious that Clarice wasn't going anywhere without a fight, and so Noon had decided that it was time to take drastic measures to make sure nothing jeopardized his future as a wealthy, respected, married farm owner in his hometown. The following morning, Saturday the 19th of August, the Chevrolet was once again packed up and the trio prepared to leave town. Before they left, Noon handed Smith some cash and told him to go to the pub and buy a large bottle of stout, or dark beer, and hide it in the car somewhere, and later that night he would serve Clarice a drink laced with strychnine. Even knowing what Noon's plans were, Smith blindly complied with his request. He went to the bar and bought the beer. He carefully placed the bottle in the toolbox in the car and slowly closed the lid, aware that he was now part of a murder plot. They continued their journey north and eventually crossed the state borderline into Queensland. They drove for hours, passing small towns and villages. Smith was captivated by the new scenery. He'd never been out of New South Wales before, but in the back of his mind he was troubled by the thought of what was going to happen to Clarice. Noon, however, was focused on only one thing: where to get rid of this woman who had now become simply a nuisance to him. Late in the afternoon, Noon finally pulled over beside a creek. He motioned for Smith to get out of the car and follow him, while Clarice stayed sitting in the vehicle. When the men were out of earshot, Noon pointed to the water and asked Smith what he thought about the location. "What do you reckon?" he said. "We could chuck her in the water here." Smith, hoping he could talk Noon out of it, simply told him that the water wasn't deep enough and that they would find her body there in no time at all. Smith had hoped that if he could delay Noon's plans for as long as possible, maybe he would forget about the whole thing. Noon agreed that perhaps the water in the creek was too shallow, and so they walked back to the car. Clarice questioned where they'd been, but Noon just told her it had nothing to do with her. Smith and Noon made camp for the night, and the three made dinner over a fire. The next morning, early on Sunday the 20th of August, Noon, Smith and Clarice packed up the camping gear and their belongings and hit the road again. They slowly made their way through southern Queensland towns without talking to each other. They all sat in silence, caught up in their own thoughts. Smith, thinking about the dire situation he now found himself in, hoping beyond all hope that Noon had forgotten his murderous plan. Clarice, thinking about how cold Big Jack was becoming towards her, but determined to not let him get away. And Noon, despite what Smith hoped, thinking about the best place to dump a body. They stopped for fuel and continued driving north, passing through the outskirts of Brisbane, through Ipswich, Marburg, and headed west towards Toowoomba. It was late afternoon as they drove through a small country town. They came across a public reserve, and Noon decided it was the place they were going to stop at and camp for the night. He stopped the car in the reserve so that the main road and any farmhouse residences nearby were blocked by the trees. Smith saw that there was a large watering hole near where they had parked, and he knew that the idea in Noon's head was still as prevalent as ever. It came to Smith then that Noon had not asked him to keep an eye out for a good place to stop, which was the custom on their trip. He recalled how deliberate Noon had been through the day while he was driving, like he'd intended to come to this spot the entire time. Clarice remained in the back seat of the car while the men set up the tent fly over the vehicle and made camp. It was raining, and Noon was worried that the fire they'd made would go out. Smith wandered off to find something to place over it and protect it, and wandered across some rusted pieces of tin that would work. He also brought back wood, small twigs and logs for the fire, and larger sticks to use as tent pegs. When he dropped these at camp and went back for more firewood, Noon stopped him. Noon told Smith that he was going to kill Clarice that night, and asked him to go and find a big rock or something heavy that they could use to weigh her body down. Smith said nothing, but walked away looking for wood. As he searched, Noon's words rang in his head and he noticed a large stone and made a mental note of it. He headed back to camp and made tea and dinner over the now protected fire. They settled down for the night on top of corn sacks on the grass and under the blankets they'd brought with them. About an hour after turning in, Noon asked Clarice if she would like a drink. He told her that they'd bought a bottle of beer at casino and that it was a surprise, a present for her. She said it sounded like a good idea and suggested that they all have some. Noon and Smith walked over to the toolbox where Noon poured the men a drink each. They downed the beer and then Noon poured a cupful for Clarice. He told Smith to go and get the little green bottle of strychnine and put some into the cup. Smith refused. He said he wouldn't do it. Noon, who seemed annoyed by his protege's refusal but not angry, simply walked around to the far side of the car, got the small bottle of poison, and shook some of the pink crystals into the mug. He then topped the mug off with more beer. Clarice, still lying under the tarp attached to the car, had not been able to see them, but happily accepted the cup from Noon when he offered it to her seconds later. Smith said nothing, knowing that he was about to watch the woman be poisoned. Clarice took a small sip of the beer and immediately spat it out. She told Noon it was far too bitter for her and that she couldn't drink it. Noon demanded that she drink it. It was the same beer both of the men had just drunk and there was nothing wrong with it. Clarice declined and simply told him she didn't want it. She tipped the mug of beer out onto the grass, and Noon outwardly seemed to accept her refusal to drink the poisoned-laced stout without much argument. Smith was relieved, and as the three settled down again to sleep for the night, he thought that Noon might have finally given up on his idea of killing this poor woman. Smith fell into a restful sleep, thinking that things might actually be good again in the morning. But he was not asleep very long. He was woken not long after he'd fallen asleep by the sound of Clarice yelling his name. It was raining, but he could hear her clearly. She sounded panicked and she called out for him as he felt her fall on top of him. He was dazed from sleep, but felt another weight on him and realized that Noon was on top of Clarice, who were both falling over him. Terrified, Smith tried to stand up and he heard Noon speak directly to him. Noon told him to go, to run, to get out while he still could. Smith realized he was in trouble and he managed to untangle himself from the other two and crawled out of the makeshift tent. He didn't know what to do. He was so scared, so he stood where he was, listening to the violent fight that was happening inside the tent. The rain was letting up, and now all he could hear was silence. Well, it was silent apart from a faint gurgling sound. He decided to see what was happening in the tent. He grabbed his torch and turned it on. He found Noon on all fours, hovering over the still figure of Clarice Murphy. She was lying on the ground, mouth open. The gurgling sound he could hear was coming from her throat. Noon looked up at the beam of light and wasted no time telling Smith to go and find the rock he'd seen earlier, telling him they had to be quick. They had to put her in the water and make sure that she sank to the bottom. Instead of refusing, instead of running for help, Smith went back to the place that he'd seen the rock earlier, picked it up, and carried it back to where Noon and Clarice were. The pair had still been in their underwear, and Noon told Smith that they had to dress her. So Smith, still showing unending obedience, helped Noon pull a dress over Clarice Murphy's lifeless body. Noon told Smith to take her feet while he took her head, and they carried Clarice Murphy to the water's edge. They placed her down at the bank, and Noon told Smith to go back the 50 feet or so and get the rock. He also added that Smith better bring some rope with him too. Smith went back to camp and removed a length of rope that had been tying the tent down. He once again picked up the rock and carried both back to where Noon was at the edge of the lagoon. When he got back, he saw that Noon was crouched low over Clarice's body. He watched Noon put his hand to her chest, and when Noon looked up at him, he told Smith that she was dead. Noon grabbed the rope and the stone from Smith and proceeded to tie one end of the rope to the rock and the other end around her neck. He placed the rock on Clarice's chest, and they made 2 attempts to throw her into the water. The first time, Smith, in a fit of panic over what was happening, let her go too early, but the second attempt saw Clarice Murphy's body, weighted down with the large heavy stone, sink into the water. As Smith turned to walk away, Noon requested the torch from him, and with one last look over the water with the torchlight, Noon announced that that was it. She was gone. Noon and Smith hurried back to the car and gathered up all of their belongings. Noon was obviously in a huge rush to get the hell out of there and made sure that they left nothing at the scene. It was not yet daylight when they left Glenore Grove and headed back onto the main road. It was a few hours before Noon spoke again to Smith, and it was only to curse Clarice and tell Smith that he'd had to hit the woman with the car's crank handle. Smith did not respond. It was late afternoon when they arrived in the small Queensland town of Dalby. As Noon pulled the car to a stop outside the main hotel, he turned to Smith and said, "Just make sure you keep your bloody mouth shut about what happened back there, or you'll be as much to blame as me." He told Smith that they were in this together now. Smith just nodded, and the men checked into the hotel under the names of Noonan and Burgess. They left again early the next morning, and heavy rain made it a slow and hard trip. They stayed overnight in a farmhouse before continuing on the way to Kingaroy. Noon was back in his home territory now, but they still had business to take care of before they could show up in Kingaroy. At about 3 p.m. on Wednesday the 23rd of August, they noticed a large log on fire on the left-hand side of the road, and as they got closer to it, Noon announced that it looked like a good place to pull over and get rid of Clarice's belongings. Smith had not spoken much since Glenore Grove and simply nodded again. Noon seemed to be at ease, pulling the car over, starting a small fire so he could boil water for tea. And while their tea was steeping, he started rummaging through Clarice's suitcases, pulling out bundles of clothing. He told Smith to take the clothes and put them on the big log fire while he continued searching through her things. Smith, scared for his own life, but now realizing what Noon said was most likely true, he was an accomplice, did as he was told. When he returned to the car, Noon had removed everything from the suitcases that wouldn't burn, and they took 1 case each and threw it onto the fire. They found more logs for firewood and made the fire bigger just to make sure that everything would be reduced to ashes. They spent an hour making sure there was no trace of the items they had burnt, and they packed the remainder of Clarice's things into a sugar bag, Noon telling Smith that they'd get rid of it later. They had travelled only a short distance before Noon pulled into a side road and drove up to a farm. The farm was owned by an old friend of Noon's, Matt Muller, and although Muller was not at home, a young farmhand made them tea and a meal for what he saw as just weary travellers. Muller arrived back at around dinner time, where Noon introduced Smith to him as Jack Burgess. Noon and Muller stayed up well into the night, talking, drinking, and catching up on old times. Matt Muller accompanied the men the next morning to Kingaroy. As they wandered around the town, Smith realised that not only was Noon a local, but he was highly regarded by the town. He stopped and chatted to almost everyone they came across, and he also found out that the residents had even thrown Noon a going-away party back in February when he'd left. Smith couldn't understand how Noon could be so casual. He had killed a woman, and they had disposed so callously of her body only 4 days before, and here he was attracting a shitload of attention and making his presence known everywhere they went. Meanwhile, the dead woman's stuff was still just sitting in the back seat of his car. It was getting dark by the time Noon decided that he and Smith were going to move on to Crawford, the town just outside of Kingaroy, and as they were on their way there, Noon pulled the car over near a large dam. Smith realised that Noon was just as familiar about this patch of water as he had been in Glenore Grove. Noon told Smith that it looked like a good place to get rid of the sugar bag full of items that belonged to Clarice. They couldn't find any stones or rocks to weigh down the bag, but decided instead to fill it with dirt from the bank. Noon threw the bag into the water and watched it sink below the surface. He told Smith that it would be safe there, that no one would ever find it, because this particular dam had never run dry. Back on the road, Smith was quiet, and it wasn't long before Noon had stopped the car again. He had realised that he had left 2 ladies' hats in the back of the vehicle and decided that they too needed to be dealt with. They found a small patch of clear land and started a fire. Noon placed both hats in the flames and the 2 of them watched them burn into nothing. Noon was satisfied that all of Clarice's belongings had now been destroyed or hidden where they'd never be found, and with that, they got back into the car and headed to Crawford. They arrived at another farm owned by another old friend of Noon's, Arthur Ashworth. After happily agreeing to have them both stay there, Smith still being introduced as Jack Burgess, Noon then suddenly announced that he was going to go and stay at the Lisa gang's place. He told Smith he'd be back in the morning, and Smith could only assume that he was going to go and catch up with his fiancée and her family. Smith ended up staying at the Ashworth farm for 5 days before being offered work on a farm nearby owned by the Gibsons. Noon periodically stayed there with him and sometimes would stay at his fiancée's father's or brother's farm. Smith was so distracted by what had happened that he was unable to eat or sleep properly and ended up injuring his right wrist so badly that he was unable to work. He wanted and needed to get away from Noon. They decided to go their separate ways in mid-September. Smith had been looking for work outside of Crawford and Noon was content to stay with the Lisa gangs. Smith was tormented by what he and Noon had done to Clarice Margaret Murphy, and over the last few days had convinced himself that there was only one person he could turn to for help and advice: his mother. He wrote to her at the Hastings Hotel in New South Wales where she worked. The letter read, "My own dear mother. Well, mother dear, this isn't very nice to write and tell you, but I can't keep it from you any longer. You know the chap I left with. He had a woman with him, supposed to be his wife, but was not. He did for her on the way up, and as I do not know what to do for the best, so I came up here with him. It has just about driven me mad. So, mother, I want your advice on the matter, whether I should go to the police or not, as I am damn nearly mad with worry. Well, dear mother, if you send me a wire, put yes if you want me to go to the police, and no if not. Then you can write later. Try and get a wire here by Saturday. From your heartbroken son, sealing a letter that I never had to do before. If something don't soon come, I will go mad. Don't you worry, mother dear. Sealed with tears. P.S. Take this and burn it. John, XX. Oh, if I had stopped at home." A few days later, on Tuesday the 19th of September, Smith obtained a new job, one on the farm owned by Mr. Harry Freeman. Now, what Noon and Smith didn't know is that almost 2 weeks before Smith's new job started, a fault was detected in the water supply at the Kingaroy railway station. John Boyd and James Murchison, 2 employees at the railway, were sent to investigate the issue. A crack in the concrete piping had caused water to steadily leak from the upper dam. The dam still had about 3 feet of water left in it when they checked, and they would need to return in a couple of weeks to carry out maintenance to stop the leak entirely. When they did come back, the day after Smith had started his new job, the dam was almost entirely empty. But sitting in a small puddle of water in the middle of it was a sugar bag, a full, bulging sugar bag. Murchison carefully made his way through to the middle of the dam and cut the bag down the side with his pocket knife. Some women's items fell out, and the workers made a note to themselves to remember to inform the police when they got back to town. When they'd finished their repairs and made their way back to Kingaroy, they stopped in at the police station and told Sergeant Casey what they had found. Casey took another officer, Constable Herbert Winter, down to the dam to investigate the bag. When they removed the bag from the dam and emptied it out into the ground, apart from a heap of dirt and mud, they found a tortoiseshell manicure set, a small clock, a pair of suede gloves, a pair of corsets, a scarf, a plush-lined ring case, a Red Cross appeal badge, a hospital badge, another badge inscribed with 2 black crows, a thimble, earrings, a safety pin with religious medals attached, a beaded necklace, a brooch carved with the letter C, 2 hairpins, a pearl necklace, a small mirror, and 1 snakeskin shoe. He took the bag and all of its contents back to the Kingaroy police station, And although he wasn't exactly sure what he might be dealing with, it had been hard to miss the reports that had come in a couple of weeks earlier about a body that had been found in Glenore Grove, as the information had been sent to every Queensland police station. Casey began working on the assumption that the bag of belongings he had just recovered were connected to that crime. After all, it wasn't a stretch to imagine that these items might have belonged to the woman who had been recovered from the water. The next day, all of the Kingroy residents learnt about the discovery of the sugar bag of woman's things being found in the empty dam. Everyone including Big Jack Noon and Little Jack Smith. Although Noon was right that the dam never went dry naturally, a small crack in a concrete pipe somewhere along the line was all it had taken to empty the dam and uncover, if I may, damning evidence. Casey noticed one thing in particular about the items: the shoe that had been found in the bag and had recently been repaired. Half of its sole had been replaced with a fancy new cromhide rubber. It was the beginning of the end for Smith, the discovery of the items that he and Noon had thrown into the dam. His mother had written back to him telling him to report what he knew, but he was confused and scared and so had yet to make a decision. When he heard that the items had been found, he wrote to her again, telling her that he was sick with worry and that he wanted to come home to her and tell her the truth of what had happened. He said in this letter, "I wish at times the earth would open up and swallow me out of the road. Then I would have no worry." He told her to write as soon as she could while he struggled with the decision of what to do. She wrote back only a few days later. "My dear son, your most anxious letter to hand today. I have been very worried about you, dear. I think perhaps it would be best to report it, as he will be found out in the finish, and then it will bring it harder on you when it wasn't your doing. Why should you keep him under cover, as he may do harm to you or someone else? He isn't fit to be at large, and it is too much of a strain for you to have to bear. It would have been best if you had reported it at the time, but I suppose he had you bound over, that you did not know what to do, and tell you to change your name. Of course you must tell the truth. Dear son, think this over, and don't you think it the best thing to do for you? For you can't do your work when you have such a worry, for I know what it is with me. I never told anyone. Well, dear, about coming home. I, of course, would like to have you with me, but of course there isn't any work about here. Wait for a while where you are to see how things go, and then perhaps you may work your way back this way later on, where you won't be so far away. But there isn't anything over this way at all just now. We are all well here, so I can't write any more. So with love from your loving mother and sisters." Smith received this letter on the 9th of October, and it finally prompted him to take some action. He wrote a short letter addressed to the local police, and as Harry Freeman was due to go into town the next morning, he offered to drop it in for him. Before he gave the note to Freeman, the one that would see him arrested, he replied to his mother. He told her that he had written to the police to tell them everything, and he also said that in case anything happened to him and he wasn't able to get home to tell her the truth of it, he wanted to put it in the letter. He said, "Well, we were camped under a tent fly on the side of the car. I was dead to the world asleep and I heard a scream, which I partly woke, and I heard her call Little Jack twice. Next thing she was on top of me and him on top of her, throttling her. He said to me, 'Get out while your luck is in.' It took me all my time to get from under them. I was scared to death. I didn't know what to do for the best, to clear away, as I had no money on me, so I was in a fix. He made me help him carry her down to the waterhole. He said tie that stone around her neck, but I never heard him, so he done them. He made me half throw her in. I was sick for 2 days after. It happened on August 20 at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning." Smith also told his mother in this letter that he would continue to tell the truth in this case, and that if he ever came home, he would never leave again. Sergeant Arthur Casey and his officers listened to this retelling of the horrendous murder of a poor young pregnant woman and the subsequent dumping of her body and destruction of her belongings. By this time it was almost midnight, and Casey knew that he needed to get an early start, so he wrapped up the questioning and interrogation of Smith and left him in a cell in the station's lockup. At 4 a.m. the next morning, he met with Fallon and Wagland and prepared to head out to the farm that Noon was staying at, one owned by his fiancée's brother, Ernest Leasegang. They knew that Smith being in custody was news that would travel fast, and they didn't want to give Noon the opportunity to run. They slowly pulled up at the farmhouse and saw John Wyatt Noon exiting the building. He was preparing to take a horse out, perhaps to complete morning farm work. Casey got out of the car and walked over to him. Noon confirmed his name and said that he knew Jack Smith and they had travelled together from New South Wales. He told the sergeant that he didn't know where Smith was now, but that they both travelled in his car and arrived together sometime at the end of August. He also confirmed that they had previously travelled with Arthur Burns, but that he'd had a fight with him because Burns was drinking too much, and Noon didn't want a drunk on the trip. Casey then cautiously asked Noon if he'd known a woman named Clarice Margaret Murphy. Noon admitted that he knew her, but when asked if he knew where she was, he told the officer that he'd last seen her in Casino and that he'd given her a few dollars to get back to Sydney where her mother was. He said that he'd given her a cheque for £5, or about $10. He had gone to the bank and casino and given her the money. He couldn't provide the cheque stub, and when asked who he banked with to be able to verify the exchange, he told Casey that he used to bank with the Commercial, but had since changed accounts. He gave an accurate description of Clarice, but when Casey asked if he was the one who had gotten her into trouble, which was his way of asking if he'd been the father of Clarice's unborn child, Noon became heated and aggravated and told the officer that he certainly had not, that he'd never touched her, and that he was engaged to another woman there in Kingaroy, and he would always stay true to her and their engagement. Casey asked if he ever had promised to marry Clarice, and Noon said no, but that Clarice had always expressed a desire to marry him, but that he didn't approve of her because she always had lots of blokes around. He did confirm that she had met up with them in Kempsey, and when Casey asked if she'd travelled as his wife, he surprised the sergeant by admitting that yes, they travelled under the names of Mr. and Mrs. Noon, and that they had shared double rooms along the way. Casey went over to the car that Noon had travelled in and began to look in it. As he reached into the right-hand rear door pocket, Noon abruptly told him that there was nothing in there, maybe some registration papers, but that's all. But Casey had pulled out of the pocket the small green bottle that contained pink crystals. He told Noon that it matched the description of the bottle that Smith had described as containing strychnine. Noon said that he didn't know anything about it. He'd never seen that bottle before, and other people had used his car, after all. He also denied having said anything about poisoning Clarice or about getting rid of her. After searching Noon's rooms at the farmhouse, the sergeant came across a letter which was signed Stick, referring to sending him a bottle of crystals. Noon confirmed that Stick was the nickname he had given his daughter, but that the bottle she was talking about was a bottle of Condy's crystals, a commonly used antibacterial and cleaning substance. It was the common name for potassium permanganate, and it was readily available at pharmacies. Another letter found by Casey was signed by J.W. Burgess, who he knew to be little Jack Smith, asking Noon to pay him back for his share of a tent fly and a car battery. They then drove Noon to Brad Leasegang's farmhouse in Crawford. There they found the tent fly that the men had used to camp, where they noticed that one of the ropes used to tie it down was missing. Noon said that they'd used some of the rope to tie down gear in the car on the trip, and one of them must have come loose and been lost along the way. Noon was taken to the Kingaroy police station where he and Smith confronted each other. Casey showed Smith the small green bottle found in the car, and Smith confirmed in front of Noon that it was the same bottle that Noon had received from the post office, and the same one that had contained the strychnine. They were both shown some of the items that had been found at the dam. Noon was asked if he'd ever seen any of the items before, and he said yes, they had belonged to Clarice Murphy. He recognised the manicure set, the gloves, and some of the other items. But he also said he could offer no explanation as to how those things could have wound up in the dam. They wrapped up the interview with Noon by asking him what route they had taken from New South Wales, and Noon said they had travelled through Armidale, Tenterfield, Wollongara and Warwick. The two men were separated and the police officers talked between themselves. They thought Noon might have been taking them for idiots. He denied ever having a relationship with Clarice Murphy, but then immediately admitted to sharing a double room with her and travelling as man and wife. They had also been surprised to hear the route that Noon said they'd taken. Armidale is 200 miles out from Casino, an almost 4-hour detour, and they felt sure he was saying it to place himself far away from Glenore Grove. They were also pretty shocked to find that he hadn't taken any steps to hide the small green bottle or letters from both his daughter and from Jack Smith. Casey returned to Noon's holding cell and asked him if there was anything further that he wanted to say to them, and Noon, realising that he was in trouble, said he'd love to tell them all about this business, but he thought that he should speak to his solicitor first. The officers sent words to Noon's lawyer, Mr. L.E.J. Cowan, and the two spent the afternoon talking. Early the next morning, Casey, Fallon, Winter, and their two suspects drove to the places that Smith had mentioned. They first went to the lane off the Kingaroy Bell Road where they could see a large fire had burnt. Smith confirmed that this was the place they had pulled up, made tea, and burnt Clarice's suitcases and clothing. Noon told the officers that he didn't know what Smith was talking about. He'd never been to that place before. Sifting through the ashes, police found various items: 4 locks that were originally fitted to suitcases, a lady's belt buckle, a handbag handle, beads, a shoe buckle, a lipstick case, some buttons, and a few other items. They then loaded Smith and Noon back into the car and headed to the Kingaroy Dam. Smith retraced their movements, indicating the path they had taken and the spot where Noon had thrown the sugar bag into the water, which happened to be the exact spot that Casey had pulled the bag from once the dam was empty. He also pointed out the spot where they had burnt Clarice's hats. They took the men back to their cells and waited for the CIB detectives to arrive. Brunelli, after arriving and being briefed, was allowed to interrogate the suspects. Smith, of course, was eager to help and answered Brunelli's questions, outlining the events in the same way that he'd told them to Casey. Noon, on the other hand, stuck to his story about sending Clarice back to Sydney with some money when they were in Casino. He did admit that he asked Smith to buy a bottle of beer, but it was only because Clarice Murphy liked to drink a lot. He just continued to defame the woman even after she was dead. He said he knew nothing about strychnine and that he only received a bottle of Condy's from his daughter at the post office in Casino. Brunelli told Noon that he would be investigating Smith's claims and Noon's answers further, and Noon said that he would be prepared to speak further on the matter, but that he wanted to speak to his solicitor again first, of course. Mr. Cowan, once again, came to the station and spent time with Noon. Early on Saturday, the 14th of October, Brunelli interviewed both men together, bringing into the room with him the evidence that had been found with Clarice when her body was discovered, along with a lock of her hair. He placed her dress and other clothing on the table, and Smith instantly recognized it. He told the detectives that it was definitely the dress that they had put on Clarice, and he knew that because they had broken the straps when they were trying to put it on her. He also confirmed that the rock that Brunelli had brought in and the rope were the ones used to weigh her down. Noon looked over all of the items but did not say a single word. The detective then took the men to the Glenore Grove lagoon, accompanied by Heard, Casey, and Noon's solicitor. Smith was eager to tell the detective exactly what happened. He detailed everything: where they set up camp, where they started the fire, even which way their heads and feet were positioned when they'd gone to bed. He walked Brunelli through the entire sequence of events, and when he got to the part where Noon had placed his hand over Clarice's chest, over her heart, and declared that she was dead, Noon said that he wouldn't have even known where her heart was. Noon told the detective that he didn't want to make a statement at this time, and that he'd like to, again, speak with Mr. Cowan. Over the next few days, Brunelli and his team retraced the journey that Smith, Noon and Clarice Murphy had made according to Smith's version of events, which at this point seemed the likely truth. They visited many of the people that the group had stayed with and even made a visit to Noon's daughter, Rosetta, to speak with her about the bottle that had been found in Noon's car. On the 23rd of October, Noon sent word to Sergeant Casey that he was finally ready to make a statement. Noon's statement started out very similar to Smith's, but he started it shortly before he met Smith. He told the detective that he had met Clarice Murphy in April or May that year while she was working for his mother. He made sure to note that he was not living with her at the time, but with his sister. He'd been working at the Melson Manufacturing Company, but found the pay was not enough to support himself, and so went into business with Arthur Burns. He met Smith while they were going through Port Macquarie. He told Casey that indeed Clarice had caught up with him in Kempsey, but that she had told him that she had gotten herself into trouble with a young man friend who had been sent to prison, and she needed them to look after her until he was released, which should have been near Christmas time. Okay, Noon. He went on to say that Burns was drinking quite a lot and was not keen on the idea of having Clarice with them, and that he was far too drunk to travel, so they had left him in Kempsey. He confirmed while on the road he did book double rooms for him and Clarice and booked them under Mr. and Mrs. Noon, but that was because he wanted to make sure that she wasn't harassed for being pregnant, single, and travelling with two men. In Maxville, he said Arthur Burns caught up with them, but Noon had refused to have him along on the trip because he was still drinking too much. Here, Noon began to waver from Smith's accounts. He told the detective that he now remembered that Jack Smith and Clarice had decided back in Kempsey that Clarice would come with them as their housekeeper, and it was when they had arrived in Coffs Harbour that Smith and Clarice started getting into arguments. As they made their way through to Casino, Noon had tried to convince Clarice to stay at a boarding house, but she wouldn't, and continued to camp with them. Smith was admitted into hospital after they arrived at Casino, but the fights between him and Clarice didn't stop. In fact, Noon told Casey, they became more frequent. The two fought all the time. Noon now told the detective that he had stretched the truth when he said that he'd sent Clarice back to Sydney. He had withdrawn the money and had intended to give it to her because she had said that she wanted to go back. But apparently over the time that they were in Casino, Smith and Clarice had come to an agreement that if Noon took them both to Queensland, Smith would take care of Clarice until her young man at the prison camp was released. Noon said it was after leaving Casino that Smith had privately told him that he had no intention of keeping Clarice Murphy and that he was going to get rid of her. He said that Smith had said that he wished they'd bought a shovel so he could just dig a hole and just bury her somewhere. Now Noon got to the point where they had arrived at Glenore Grove, and he basically stated Smith's exact statement, but in reverse. That he had woken to Smith and Clarice arguing, and he had felt her fall on top of him, and that he had crawled out of the tent to see Smith standing over a lifeless Clarice. That Smith had been the one to suggest throwing her in the water. Smith had found the stone, tied it around her neck, and had asked Noon to help him throw her in. After they left the scene, it was Smith who looked for a place to burn her things. He had put the rest of her things in the sugar bag, and they had stopped on the way into Crawford to throw them into the dam. Now, he went on to explain a couple more things. One, that they threw the bottle of Condy's that was sent to him by his daughter away, and he'd never seen the small green bottle at all. 2, that he gave certain untrue answers to police when he was first questioned, because he needed to buy time to speak to his solicitor, of course. And 3, that he was completely unaware that Clarice had been married. He knew she at least had one other child, but he also knew that she had kept the company of many men while in Taree. Any one of them could have been responsible for the family way she was in. The detectives and police officers had heard enough. While Smith was forthcoming, helpful, truthful, and seemingly intent on telling them everything, Noon had evaded questions, lied, and not made a single statement about the event until after he learnt everything that Smith had said, and simply reversed the roles the men had taken. While neither of the men would escape the charges coming to them, at least Smith had the decency to come forward eventually and tell the truth. Both John Wyatt Noon and John William Burgess Smith were remanded on charges of willful murder. The remand period was extended when Noon developed appendicitis and had to be admitted to hospital for surgery, which gave the officers plenty of time to be able to track down witnesses and gather all of the evidence they had to the murder of Clarice Margaret Murphy. When Noon was discharged and he was fit to appear before a court, he and Smith faced their committal hearing on Thursday the 16th of November in Kingaroy. Noon had his solicitor, Mr. Cowan, to defend him, but Smith, who was young and without much money, chose to stand undefended. Although witnesses brought in from around the area claimed that they had known Jack Noon for many years and always found him to be trustworthy and honest, there were two witnesses that were called that put a serious dent in Noon's plans to pin the murder on Smith. The first was Government Medical Officer Dr. Alexander Castleberg, who confirmed that he had been the one to run tests on the small green bottle that Casey had found in Noon's car. The tests had come back and shown that the substance inside the bottle was pure commercial-grade strychnine. The other was a Mr. Malcolm Redman, a local Crawford farmer who testified that Noon had been employed on his farm and that both he and his daughter Rosetta had both lived with him. He also confirmed that he kept a considerable amount of strychnine in the house. He'd purchased it from his daughter Gladys Redman, who ran a chemist in town, and he had it in the house to assist with pest control of dingoes and dogs to protect the sheep on the property. He confirmed that it would have been possible for Noon to have discreetly taken some of the poison without it being noticed, as he had access to it. Once the witnesses had been called and the state had laid out the evidence they had, Inspector Carlane asked that the remainder of the hearing be transferred to Laidley, where the offence was committed. Cowan, Noon's solicitor, strongly objected and demanded that the court either release his client or commit him, and claimed that the officers were simply trying to hinder the course of the legal system. His objection, of course, was overruled and the hearing was permitted to be moved to Laidley. On Wednesday the 22nd of November, the hearing resumed in the Laidley courthouse. The courthouse was surrounded by local residents. They packed in around the small building, hoping to get a glimpse of the men who had murdered the poor woman found in their lagoon. Police had to continually ask locals to move away from the courthouse doors to allow witnesses to be able to get in and out. Through both hearings, Smith had sat in the courtroom furiously note-taking as he was representing himself, while Noon sat whistling, biting his nails, winking at spectators, and appearing completely uninterested in the proceedings. The residents of Laidley were growing to despise the man. Not only had he so carelessly killed this woman, but he had no hesitation in also killing his unborn child, and now he seemed to not be able to care less that he was about to be on trial for murder. There were many witnesses for the state, including Eddie Harm, the oldest of the children to have found Clarice to begin with, and they also questioned a 19-year-old girl called Ethel Maud, who worked about 200 yards or 180 meters from the lagoon, who testified that she had seen the car with the tent fly over it at about 5 p.m. on the 20th of August. Now, this information was relatively new to police. They had been asking for witnesses to anything unusual only from a week after this date because of the incorrect time of death stated by the government pathologist 3 months before. At the conclusion of the committal hearing, there was enough evidence meticulously gathered by police, detectives, and officers across 2 states for Noon and Smith to be committed for trial. Almost 5.5 months after Clarice Margaret Murphy's body was discovered in the Glenore Grove Lagoon on the 12th of February 1934, the men charged with her murder stood before the judge and jury. They both entered pleas of not guilty. Both of the defence counsels requested separate trials, but Justice Hugh Dennis McCrossan decided that the evidence against either one would not cause any prejudice against the trial of the other, and so refused the request. The prosecutor, Henry Thomas O'Driscoll, also stated that the Crown considers both men equally to blame for her death, and so, as far as the Crown was concerned, there would be no discrimination between them. He did go on to say that even though Smith materially assisted the state, the nature of the crime was so callous and shocking that he would be granted no favours for that. Witnesses were again called, and this time Clarice's mother was one of them. She spoke about Clarice's earlier marriages and the resulting children, how she had been caring for those children while Clarice worked hard to provide a stable income and home for them. Clarice's mother, Elizabeth Mary Roselle, could understandably not keep composure and would break down repeatedly at the thought of her daughter having been so viciously murdered by these men in front of her. Smith's mother, Susanna, also testified. She told the court that her son had written to her and told her what had happened, and she had advised him to go to the police, which is what he did. But then Rosetta Alba Noon was called to the stand. She wept openly in the witness box and confirmed to the prosecutor that her father had written to her and asked her to find a bottle of pink crystals which he kept in the trunk in his shed. She had wrapped the bottle in blotting paper, cardboard, and a brown paper bag and had sent it to him as he'd asked. When she was asked if she knew what was in the bottle, she cried as she told the court that yes, she did. It was strychnine. Over the course of 4 days, witnesses were called, including people the group had stayed with, operators from fuel stations, residents of towns they had visited, and the jury was actually taken to the site of Clarice's murder. The residents of Laidley and Brisbane surrounded not only the courthouse but the lagoon as well, but the jurors were not permitted to speak or be spoken to except by police officials. At the conclusion of the state's case against the men, the prosecution outlined the facts as they'd been presented, that Noon, being engaged to a woman in Kingaroy, went to his hometown and engaged in a relationship with his mother's housekeeper. He admits in his statement that he and Smith were both responsible for throwing the woman into the water. He and Smith, while both trying to blame the other, both admitted to either committing or being an accomplice to murder. Both Smith and Noon's defense team tried to claim that each one was simply concealing the evidence of a murder by the other. But the fact was that Clarice Murphy was not dead when she entered the water. The post-mortem had proven that she was still breathing and that she died by asphyxiation caused by drowning. Both defense teams argued that under Section 24 of the Criminal Code, that if a man did or omitted to do an act believing certain things, he was not more culpable if circumstances were other than what he actually believed them to be. Basically, they both tried to claim that if their clients thought she was already dead, then it didn't count, and they, at the most, could only be classed as an accessory after the fact. The justice quashed this argument quickly by reminding the defense counsels that the act of throwing Clarice Murphy's body into the water, the act that had caused her death, was done so in prosecution of an unlawful purpose, that purpose being to conceal a murder, and that there was a precedence for that to supersede Section 24. The case that was cited was Rex versus Woodburn and Pope. If a man shoot at a fowl wherein another hath profit, but without intending to steal, and by misadventure shall kill someone, he would be guilty of manslaughter. But if he had the intention of stealing the fowl, then the accidental killing would be murder because it was done in the prosecution of a felonious act. Justice McCrossan stated that really the only question for the jury was whether the men would be charged with murder or willful murder. The difference being that the jury would need to decide if Clarice Murphy was killed with the intention of her death, or if she was killed in prosecution of an unlawful purpose, which was her death. Confusing, right? The jury deliberated for 4 hours before returning to the courtroom to gain clarification on their instructions. The foreman, Reginald Matthews, told the justice that they had been unable to decide the degree of culpability for one of the co-defendants. After some back and forth with McCrossan, Matthews and the other 11 members of the jury left again to continue deliberating. At 9:30 p.m. on Friday the 16th of February, the jury once again filed back into the courtroom. John Wyatt Noon was found guilty of willful murder. When it came to little Jack, the jury's verdict read, "We find the prisoner John William Burgess Smith guilty of murder, with a strong recommendation for mercy on the grounds that he was not the prime mover in the crime, and that he materially assisted the course of justice." In an apathetic and deliberate manner, Justice McCrossan delivered his sentences. The sentence of the court is that John Wyatt Noon be imprisoned for life. The sentence of the court is that John William Burgess Smith be imprisoned for life, with a direction that the recommendation of the jury be forwarded to the proper authorities for their consideration. I would be prepared to make a recommendation for the reduction of sentence if asked by the proper authority for mercy or release. As the courtroom prepared to leave, the justice had one final note to make. He wondered whether Noon had purposefully chosen Glenore Grove as the place to murder Clarice Murphy. He further wondered whether he had made this choice because of the differences in punishment imposed for willful murder between Queensland and New South Wales. At any point in time, Noon and Smith could have done what they did, but they chose to wait until they'd crossed the border. Perhaps, he said, it was because Queensland in 1922 had abolished capital punishment. Had the murder been committed in New South Wales, there would have been no satisfactory grounds for mercy. He ended by saying that perhaps this may be a matter for legislature to consider an amendment to the law. The prisoners were escorted to their cells in the infamous Boggo Road jail to begin their life sentences. In 1936, Noon attempted to take his own life inside his cell, but the attempt failed. On Valentine's Day in 1950, Noon was transferred to the minimum security prison farm in Palin Creek in Queensland. He was allowed to remarry later in life and was buried in the Mount Gravatt Cemetery next to his wife after his death in 1972. Smith was moved to the Marburg prison on the 7th of November 1944 and was soon after released due to the sentencing remarks by Justice McCrossan. He was met by his mother at the gates of the jail upon his release, and it was believed that he moved to Tasmania shortly after that to start over. It is unknown where he lived or when he died. Clarice Margaret Murphy, while seemingly unloved by the men in her life, was loved by her mother, her surviving children, and a community that didn't know her but knew that she deserved better. She has surviving family even now, and they will help to preserve her memory. Well, that one was way longer than I thought it was going to be, but you never know where the case will take you until you get there. But that's it. That is the case of the girl in the lagoon, the Glenore Grove mystery. I will be back with more Australian true crime, but until then, be good, be safe, and don't murder anyone. Bye.